Good afternoon, and thank you for joining SAFE's Grid in Peril webinar. I'm Thomas Coleman, Executive Director of SAFE's Grid Security Project. For those of you not familiar with SAFE, SAFE is an action-oriented, bipartisan, nonprofit organization focused on transportation, energy, and supply chain policies that advance the economic and national security of the U.S. and our allied nations. With a 20-year history and record of success, we often refer to ourselves actually as a think and do tank. We've convened business and military leaders since 2004, about 20 years now, to advocate for a more sustainable and resilient energy system, with a primary focus on reducing the nation's oil dependence. To complement our work on transportation energy policy, the Safe Grid Security Project is a new initiative with a singular mission to support both reliability and resilience of our nation's power grid, certainly understanding that grid security and national security are intertwined. An insecure power grid is a clear and present danger to our national security. The Grid Security Project is developing a series of reports centered around grid reliability. The first report, Grid in Peril, which has been released today, it'll be released later today, is a new initiative with a singular mission to support both reliability and resilience of our nation's power grid. The present deficiencies in the power grid that are threatening our nation's ability to remain both globally competitive and as a result, threatening our very own national security. This report is being released today in conjunction with the webinar, and it can be found in the link provided during the webinar. Subsequent reports will discuss transmission, generation, cyber and physical security, as well as national security, and solution sets around those very critical issues as they relate to the current state of our power grid. So we'll start with some opening remarks that we have from Senator Hickenlooper of Colorado, who will discuss our nation's transmission grid and some important initiatives that the senator and his staff are working on, as well as Representative Latta of Ohio, who will talk about the importance of grid reliability as it relates to national security, and he'll focus on some of our cybersecurity issues as well. That will help frame our discussion today, and then I'll turn it over to Naureen Malik. Naureen is a reporter covering power and the climate crisis. She's from Bloomberg News, and she'll moderate today's panel for Grid in Peril. Thank you very much.
Hi, John Hickenlooper here. Thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about something I've been obsessed with lately, interregional transmission and how it can enhance grid security. To me, building interregional transmission is like building the interstate highway system. The highway system was built to help move our military in times of crisis, but most of the time it's just helping to move people and goods around. So there's both a security and economic benefit. The same goes for interregional transmission, because the best locations for solar farms, wind farms, and small nuclear plants are far away from our major urban areas, and we need electrical highways, therefore, to bring low-cost power to where it's needed. Although these lines will usually be moving energy generated in rural areas into urban load centers, power can move in either direction in times of crisis. So just like utilities support one another with mutual aid agreements, interregional transmission allows regions to come to each other's aid when a big storm rolls in. Interregional transmission lines are bigger than the weather and can tap into diverse resources to keep the lights on in times of need. And that's why I've introduced my Big Wires Act. It requires regions to be able to move 30% of their peak load with their neighbors. The bill is fully tech neutral with respect to how to meet the requirement and what generation sources get interconnected. Thanks for having me on, and thank all of you for all the work you do.
Hi, I'm Bob Latta, and I'm sorry I couldn't be with you today because of our congressional calendar. But just to talk about grid security and the innovation that's going on out there. I serve on the Energy and Commerce Committee, and I also serve on the Energy Subcommittee, but I'm also the chair of the Communications and Technology Subcommittee. And grid security is something I'm very concerned about, because when I look around our country, what's happening, and around the world, what could happen, that we have to do everything we possibly can. For instance, I was in North Carolina not too long ago looking at the attack that happened on the Duke Energy substation. And we also had 2 substations attacked out west. What happens if we don't have enough transformers to replace all this damage that's done, if we have a coordinated attack across the country? Or the radiators that are used at these substations, we're going to be in trouble. So it's absolutely essential that we do everything we possibly can, and that's why with the Grid Innovation Caucus, which I'm one of the co-chairs of, that's important. It's why the legislation I've led in the past and signed into law when we look at upgrading our grid to making sure that we have the products that are used in the grid that are cyber safe, that companies can make sure. I know when I'm in my district and going around Ohio, I see all the work that's being done by so many companies and on the energy side, trying to make sure that they're safe. And there's a lot of dollars that are being expended by the companies. It could be from a small electric co-op to a large company. But this is being done because of one thing: we have to make sure that we have our sources protected across our country. So thank you very much for all that you're doing. And again, I wish I could be with you today, but we want to make sure that we do everything we possibly can in Washington. And I always say this: my door is always open. If you have any ideas or questions or anything that you want to get to me, please give me a call. Thanks very much.
There's an urgency to deal with these issues, not only from climate change and increasing demand, but the Biden administration also has a goal to have a zero emissions grid by 2035. I'm Naureen Malik with Bloomberg News, and we're going to dive right in with LS Power's CEO, Paul Segal. LS Power is a developer of generation and transmission across the country, from the largest U.S. grid in PJM to the West Coast in California and kind of everything in between. To get us started, Paul, could you talk a little bit about the company's development goals, and then also kind of what Washington doesn't understand about the intersection of grid security and, this urgency to deal with these issues?
Sure. Thanks, Naureen. Thanks, Tom, for hosting this. So LS Power, we are a developer, owner, operator of a variety of electrical infrastructure with a focus on maintaining and developing a grid that's both reliable and affordable. And we attack that typically through both competition and innovation. We invest primarily in natural gas-fired power generation. We have been a very active developer, owner, investor in renewables and storage over the last decade or so. And we've been one of the leading companies out there developing competitive high voltage transmission. We also invest in a variety of what I would characterize as new energy transition businesses, everything from EV charging to demand response and renewable natural gas. So a fairly broad lens on our industry. And what I would say is there are a lot of policy winds blowing in a variety of different directions. And ultimately what we have is a system that operates on the basis of physics. It's a very complex system. There are many different components to it. Policy has a tremendous overriding impact on what we build, when we build it, the cost at which it gets built. And there's really probably nothing more important today than policy, and policy pointing the direction for the evolution of our grid. And that's our area of focus. Our area of focus is to try to stay ahead of these developments and to have what I would hope to be a honest conversation about the energy transition, how we go from here to our clean energy future in a rational, non-chaotic way.
Great. And now we have Admiral Howard. Admiral Michelle Howard is a member of SAFE's Energy Security Leadership Council and retired 4-star admiral who served concurrently as the commander of the U.S. Naval Forces Europe and U.S. Naval Forces Africa. She was also vice chair of naval operations and achieved many historical firsts in her distinguished naval career. It's an honor to have you with us, Admiral Howard. We're hoping you can share your perspective on the intersection of grid security and national security as you've seen it throughout your career.
Thank you, Naureen, and thank you, SAFE, for hosting us today. So in my 35 years, I basically was able to sail the 7 seas and conduct operations around the globe. My first encounter with electricity as a weapon was 1996. I was on an amphibious ship. We were asked to go into the Black Sea and pay a port call to the new nation of Georgia. Georgia had decided to build a pipeline from the Caspian Sea to the Black Sea, ensuring revenue and the country's independence and self-sufficiency. The Russians were against it. They were cutting off power the old-fashioned way, just turning off the switches so that the people of Georgia would go days without electricity. The Russians were trying to force the Georgians to not build this pipeline. The United States decided to send a ship in there to show the flag, literally, and let the Georgians know we were for them and for them building the pipeline. Years later, I saw electricity used again by the same Russian Federation with the attack on the Ukrainian electrical grid, taking out power for hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian citizens, this time more sophisticated, through a cyber attack. So when you look at the powering of our military bases, particularly stateside, we're reliant on the commercial industry. Most of our bases are not self-sufficient. Why is that important? Stateside, our bases do training, they do maintenance, but they're also where we deploy and move logistics for our forces that are forward. So when you don't have power, you don't have fuel pumps and you can't refuel airplanes. When you don't have power, you don't have heating and cooling for the people who work on the bases. You don't have power, you can't move water. And people need water to drink, and you need water for a lot of our systems for the bases. But more importantly, you need power for weapon systems. Our military, our missile defense system runs off electrical power, and it's online 24/7. Years ago, the Center for Naval Analysis in 2015 garnered together of retired senior military officers to look at the electrical grid. Their conclusion was the military was far too vulnerable in this area. And they cited everything from potential cyber attacks to the sniper on PG&E who took out several transformers and did $15 million worth of damage. That report, even though it's 7 years old, 8 years old now, foreshadowed a lot of what we're talking about today. We have to have a resilient grid. We have to have a way to distribute energy between regions. We have to have backup power. We need to use technology to modernize the grid. They concluded with a pretty important point. They said, look, renewable distributed energy is not just a policy objective, it's an operational imperative. Thanks, Naureen.
Thanks, Admiral. And now Brett Perlman is the Chief Executive Officer of the Center for Houston's Future and has spent much of his career on grid reliability and power market structure, having served on the Public Utility Commission of Texas. And Texas's grid has made national news given the devastating impact of Winter Storm Uri in February 2021, which tragically resulted in hundreds of lives lost. It's a sobering reminder of some of the challenges our grid currently faces. Brett, given your expertise in the space, can you tell us more about the challenges facing the Texas grid and how it's impacting the state?
I'd be happy to, Naureen. And I just want to thank Tom for inviting me to be part of this and for the wonderful report that you're releasing today. I think what we're seeing in ERCOT is just a prime example of some of the trends and some of the issues that you've highlighted. So let me just kind of illustrate some of that by giving you a little bit of history of what we achieved in ERCOT almost 20 years ago in terms of deregulating our power grid and creating a competitive market that basically created choice for 6 million Texas customers. And also along the way created the largest renewables market in the country with over 30 gigawatts of renewables that we've added in the last 20 years. This was at the same time that we continued to add baseload generation in terms of new gas-fired generation. So I think what we achieved over the last 20 years was a remarkable achievement. As you mentioned, Winter Storm Uri changed everything. It changed really the way we think about our power grid. Some of that was due, I think, to regulatory failures, lack of weatherization, but it also, I think, pointed out some fundamental flaws in the way we think about market structure that we need to address, and I'll talk about those in a second. The other thing is that we just completed a summer with weeks of triple-digit temperatures that resulted in a new peak in Texas of over 85,000 megawatts compared to our prior peak of 82,000 megawatts. So a significant increase in peak demand. ERCOT was very successful in keeping the lights on by asking Texans to conserve energy and by bringing new ancillary service methodologies to the market. In other words, ways of achieving reliability. But this came at a cost. It's estimated that there was a $8 to $10 billion cost this summer in terms of the real-time market prices that we experienced by having this additional capacity be available. And so I think Texas is now in a new normal where our economy is growing. That's a good thing. And so demand of power is growing. But that's just really the tip of the iceberg. Because as we start to think about decarbonization and adding electric vehicles, trying to create green hydrogen, we're going to need to have much more renewable generation and flexible generation as part of our mix. And so ERCOT has estimated there's about 48 gigawatts of additional projects that are already on the drawing boards that are going to have to be accommodated in order to make our grid grow. And so we really do need a new framework for thinking about how we manage the grid. And in a report that we wrote with a number of my colleagues called Never Again, it's 5 of us who are served for over 2 decades from both parties called for a different approach. And I think many of those same ideas are really reflected in the Grid and Peril report that SAFE has released today. We need flexible, dispatchable generation. We need more demand response. We need distributed power, and we need to have more transmission, bringing renewables back to market and interconnecting our grids, as well as weatherization to ensure that we do have some gas supply for the plants that we continue to rely on. And so this is a big challenge because it's going to take all of us working together in order to achieve this new framework. And it's something that I think we're very proud of in Texas that we've done in the past. And I think it could be a beacon to the country as we start to look about how the Texas market is going to meet the challenges of the future.
Thanks, Brett. And Tom, you're the executive director of the new Grid Security Project at SAFE, an organization which has brought together business and military leaders to address energy security and transportation policy challenges. So we're hosting this webinar as part of the release of your first report, Grid and Peril, which has some sobering lessons that we need to all pay attention to. Can you share some of the top line findings with us?
Sure. Thank you very much, Naureen. And definitely sobering indeed. And so great to hear the remarks from Paul Segal and Admiral Howard and Brett Perlman, which kind of bring this all together. Because as Paul mentioned, we are in a mid-transition. Our grid is changing faster than it ever has. We were a grid that was completely comprised of all fossil resources. Things were simple. Now we have the influx of renewables. We have more distributed generation and the opportunity for microgrids. We're trying to reduce our carbon footprint. And at SAFE, of course, we believe that we can absolutely do that, but we have to do it in a way that promotes both reliability and resilience. So as far as the overall power grid goes, we know that demand is going to increase. We are trying to electrify our vehicle fleet. We're trying to reindustrialize. We're trying to bring jobs back from overseas, yet we still have these big looming issues. We have what's called these black swan events: Winter Storm Uri, Winter Storm Elliott, wildfires in California. Look at the impacts of the recent wildfires in the state of Hawaii as well. And the report argues that black swan events are no longer the right moniker, because they're normal events now. It's no longer these big black swan events. We can expect to have more hurricanes, wildfires, and situations where we're actually shedding load. We shed load in Winter Storm Uri. It cost us over 200 lives. It cost us billions of dollars in lost economic activity. We also shed load in Winter Storm Elliott. So we definitely need national policies around growing our transmission. Growing transmission will also help during these black swan events when we're able to transfer megawatt hours from one area to another. We also need to increase our generation. As Admiral Howard mentioned, our military is on the same exact power grid that you and me are on every day. And so a loss in the power grid is certainly a threat to our national security as well. And then we heard Representative Latta talk about the cyber and physical attacks that are also on the increase. So all of these point to situations where we need to reform our policies and the regulatory environment to make these things happen, as we're trying to grow the electric grid, electrify our vehicle fleet, reindustrialize our economy, bring jobs back, grow our manufacturing. It all points to the necessity of a national policy around our power grid, promoting increased transmission, increased generation, and a reliable transmission to reducing our carbon footprint.
And the grid is rapidly transforming in a large part because of the adoption of renewable sources like wind and solar generation. We saw that Texas is now the leader, has been for a while, in renewable generation. This has gone a long way in reducing the carbon intensity of the grid, but it's also creating fresh challenges, like shifting the critical hours that need to be solved for, like in the evening at sunset. And whether it's Texas, California, or the East Coast, it's apparent that there's more transmission that's needed. Maybe, Paul, you can start by talking about, like, what are the biggest barriers to developing transmission capacity, how it's impacting the ability to decarbonize, and what will it really take to accelerate the transition? It takes like 10, 15 years to build a big transmission line right now.
You're absolutely right. Building transmission in the US is tough. And there are a number of obstacles. I think most talked about is the permitting difficulty. I'm going to leave that one to the side for a minute because I think it has been explored. We can talk more about it specifically if you'd like. But there are many other factors. One of the biggest is the lack of clarity around who will plan the transmission in many instances. Ideally, we would have a grid planning function that's pushed by a strong regulator like the FERC down to independent transmission operators. Certain states are doing this well, where they have control of both their resources and their transmission systems, are typically single state transmission operators. There's also the question of who will pay for the transmission, especially when it becomes interregional. When we have large RTOs, there are typically mechanisms in place for distributing the costs of that transmission across the participating utilities. But when we move to between RTOs, there's complexity around who will pay and how much. How do we measure the benefits of those transmission resources? These are all things that we can tackle, but they're complicated and they require determination and perspective that's shared by both ideally federal regulators or legislators and the states. And these are hard problems to solve.
Admiral, I might ask you this question, kind of following up on that comment about there needing to be bigger planning. You know, one common theme that comes up a lot or concern is similar to what Paul just said, that there isn't someone just overarching, looking at the whole national level and trying to decide what needs to be built, whether there need to be these national corridors. And a lot of people invoke like the Eisenhower era of like the highway system. Do you think that there needs to be like the federal government or FERC needs to take up that mantle, or the DOE to like decide what the corridors should look like and everything that goes with that?
Absolutely. I mean, more than one defense entity has come to the conclusion this is only going to get fixed through a whole of government effort. This is not going to be a single entity like DOE or an organization like FERC. It's going to require coordinated legislation, similar to what Congressman Latta was talking about. We have got to come up with literally a strategic plan for energy, not just renewable energy, but energy and resilient energy, reliable energy.
Idea of a reliable energy and the security challenges that come with that. The Center for Naval Analysis had pointed to the possibility of social unrest that could come out of longer and more severe power outages. And distressingly, they point to the fact that these risks are known by enemies, foreign and domestic. Admiral, how serious is this risk, and is this being appropriately addressed by policymakers?
We've already seen domestic adversaries take on electrical transmissions, and the motivations can go anywhere from, extreme greenies who just don't like the idea of power, to folks who are trying to disrupt national security or local governments. There's a range of motivation, but it's already happened. Cyber attacks have already happened from different other national players, and not just electrical. The Iranians, went after a dam in New York years ago. So whatever our source is, it's vulnerable. From a defense perspective, I would say the Army has exhibited some leadership in this. I would say their first big event was from climate. The Redstone Arsenal in Alabama was knocked offline by a tornado. The base was for about 8 days. And that's a multi-federal installation. NASA has one of their biggest space mission organizations there. It supports the International Space Station 365 days a year. Missile Defense Agency's there. We test rockets there. Defense Intelligence Agency has their Ballistic Missile Defense Intelligence Group there. So getting knocked offline for 8 days means we lose intelligence gathering opportunities. We put those, astronauts in peril up on the space station. That's just unsatisfactory. But you can't get there by trying to recreate redundant mission. We're not going to be able to say, hey, we'll have this base and then we'll have another base in another part of the country. So the Army went after trying to create microgrids. 2018, they tasked all the bases to come up with a industrial energy plan for in case of outages that would affect electrical and water. They literally started energy resiliency exercises where they shut down a base deliberately and try to figure out how do we get to enough backup generation to keep the mission going, whether it's deploying forces or training. The other services have done similar things, and I just want to make one. So for the Marine Corps, they took a small base in Albany, Georgia, and it's really off the grid. They installed natural gas generators. They now get the gas from a local landmine, and that creates the electricity for the base. They reran ducts underneath the ground so that air that needs to be cooled for facilities is naturally cooled. And they installed solar panels to power barracks and facilities on the base. And they basically reached zero carbon emission this year.
You're giving shape to my next question. I'd love for you to answer and all the others to chime in as well. But in this age to electrify everything, you know, historically, we've thought about national security in more simplistic terms, for lack of a better word, but like you think about the oil reserves and the strategic petroleum reserves in this new era, what do the strategic reserves look like? And if you could start, Admiral.
That's a great point on our strategic reserves, because without electrical power, how do the refineries work? We are, you know, you're vulnerable without electrical power. So in our case, the US, when you're talking sort of an electrical reserve, we've got to figure out this whole storage down to whether it's batteries at the residential level, new storage, whether it's giant flywheels or just innovation. I think we have got to get to the point where we can figure out how we can get to long-term electrical storage so we can have electricity on demand, not just we're creating electricity and we're consuming it.
And Paul, how do you think about this idea? Because as a developer of these assets, it's critical that you make sure that they're online and able to serve when ready.
Yeah. Look, I think there's a lot of difficulty in creating a large electrical reserve. I think the best thing that we can do is build a robust, reliable, and resilient grid that allows us through transmission and through proper planning to share resources. Right now, the energy storage that we have is basically some version of nuclear fuel, natural gas, and coal. And we're trying to move that to battery storage. We're trying to move that to some newer ideas around storage, hydrogen perhaps. All of them are ultimately fairly time limited. And we're taking typically one form of energy and converting it or storing it in another form of energy that is available for us to function over a discrete, fairly limited period of time. When we have a robust grid where we can pull power from our neighbors that may have different resources, we can leverage those resources, use them more efficiently, more economically, and ultimately provide that kind of redundancy that's critical for reliability and for resilience.
Great. And Brett, what does this look like from the consumer end? I mean, the Admiral talked about rooftop solar and batteries at the household level. Are consumers going to have to step up here in this new era, or are they integral part of this grid of the future?
Well, I think the consumers are really the solution to this problem. They're also kind of one of the reasons we have the problem, at least in Texas during the summer. You know, we all love our air conditioning, and so we want to run it, when it's a hot day in August. We need to have really a more refined way of thinking about, you know, the price of that, and that can be through differentiated pricing. It can be through technology. There's just a huge resource that we're not really tapping into yet, and that's Joe Q. Citizen, who has actually now gotten involved in this reliability issue. I think, you know, it's interesting. One of the things that Superstorm Uri did do is that it got people familiar with the electric grid. People know what ERCOT is now, where before I don't think they had a clue. And so in some ways, getting people more engaged in managing their electric use is one of the solutions, frankly, to this problem. You know, I think it raises some challenges. Grid operators have been loath to rely on customers switching off air conditioning units and things like that, or cycling air conditioning units. But, you know, we this summer, for example, we paid over $30 million to one Bitcoin manufacturer for supporting the grid, whereas residential customers don't even have a program for participating on the demand side of the market. And so I really do think we're missing a huge opportunity by not enabling customers to get involved in this. And so I really think we need to look at this in a slightly different way than we've looked at it in the past. Whereas before, we think about inelastic demand, and we use supply basically to meet demand. In fact, I don't think demand is so inelastic. Consumers are willing to pay different prices and participate if given the choice. And so I think there is really not only a problem, but an opportunity that we have to really think differently about how we use these resources to help address this idea of the challenges that we're going to face in the future.
Got it. And Brett, I hope you appreciate I put ERCOT's control room as my backdrop for you.
I love it.
But looking at Texas specifically, the tension that is across the US is really acute in Texas, which is you see consumers facing higher bills, like we're going because, transmission costs are rising, and, the market changes have to incentivize new generation, have tacked on billions of dollars of new costs for consumers just this summer. How do you balance that need of increasing reliability to make sure that there's the right generation on and the right supply on, and to make sure that it's not is a growing concern that power could become unaffordable for some, if not already?
I think you raise a great point. The first thing we need to do is to be honest. If we want higher amounts of reliability, that doesn't come for free. There are going to be costs associated with that. How those costs get spread among various classes of customers, whether they're industrial customers or consumers, I think that is, an opportunity that creates, it's an opportunity. We all have to contribute to grid reliability, but at the same time, we want to make sure that energy remains affordable, particularly for low-income customers that need to be able to buy electricity during the summer and be able to pay for it. And that's always going to be a challenge. So I'm not suggesting first that this comes for free or that there aren't equity issues involved. I think those need to be part of this discussion as well. But those are sorts of pieces of the puzzle that if we do get everybody at the table, that we can start to address. That's exactly what we did when we created the original ERCOT model, which we call SB7, in 1999. We had everyone at the table. We had consumers, we had low-income advocates, we had environmentalists, we had power generators, and we had utilities. And it's really through that sort of process that we were able to achieve what we did. So I don't think this is an unsolvable problem. I think it's one that really requires a lot of people with goodwill to come to the table and suggest solutions that are going to address what Admiral Howard just told us, which is a need to have a secure and reliable grid, not only for each of us, but for our national security.
And Paul, what would you need to see? What kind of market signals or policy clarity do you need, whether it's in Texas or PJM, MISO, or another grid, to, go gung-ho with development?
Sure. Well, I would say we are going gung-ho with development. I think we're responding to two things, typically price signals and price signals through policy. What we need, ideally, is durable policy that doesn't change, policies that's not volatile. So solving some of our problems with solutions that are comprehensive rather than piecemeal is incredibly valuable. So if we can, for example, move from a structure where one state taxes carbon through a given program and the state next door doesn't, and emissions just move from the first state to the latter state, if we had an overriding carbon either tax or cap, that is a much more durable solution that leads to lowest cost solution, durable policy that leads to the lowest cost solutions. The same can be said for the many issues that we need to deal with in this space. When we have uncertainty as a result of policy around when certain types of power plants will need to be retired. For example, Illinois passed legislation a couple of years ago that will require the plants that run the least and pollute the least to shut down the first in 2020, in 2030. That creates enormous uncertainty. It creates the probability that we'll have reliability issues well before we get to 2030, because it makes it very difficult for asset owners and operators to make decisions around how to invest when you don't know how much longer your asset can operate. So durable, clear policy, rational policy, ideally driven by economic theory, where economics prevail so that we can minimize costs, as opposed to specific resource choices or decisions being made. That's how we're going to get to a clean energy grid without the kind of bumps in the road that can be catastrophic for that path, that result from a lack of reliability or simply customers' bills becoming too prohibitive to continue down the path.
And I'm going to throw in a viewer's question because it fits right in here for Brett Perlman, or anyone can answer. Is there a realistic political path to achieve linkages between the Texas grid to the rest of the nation's power systems, as the SAFE report and many other assessments recommend? What could that path be? Is there a better Texas-only strategy?
Now we're talking real issues here. Texas has always, valued its independence, but I do think there is a way to achieve that independence and connect Texas to the rest of the United States. And I really do think that needs to be done. The issue has been really one of policy. And I think we do, and I think, Naureen, you mentioned it, or someone else mentioned it, maybe it was Paul, single states RTOs have tended to be a little bit more responsive and progressive. And so I think what we need to do in Texas is we need to maintain that regulatory flexibility, and at the same time deal with the need to have a bigger interconnection. And so, Naureen, you do have the state of Texas up there. We're a big state, but we're not as big as the Eastern Interconnect or the Western Interconnect. And sometimes I do think there is an opportunity for support. There's also an opportunity, interestingly enough, for support with our neighbors to the south. We have a different peak than we do in Texas than in Mexico. And so we already have done that. We do have some small DC ties, which have proven useful to Mexico. And so I do think there is a need for Texas, not so much to to sacrifice our hard-won independence, but really to exercise it in a different way, and that's through really interconnecting our grid with the rest of the United States, but leaving really some authority within the state to manage our own resource needs. So. To me, that is really the solution. I believe there's a bill that's been proposed in Congress that would do something similar to that, and it will take probably some sort of congressional action to achieve what I'm talking about. But I do think it's achievable, and I think it's the right answer, not only for Texas but for the country.
And Admiral, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about kind of like the stress the military faced and what it's doing to address this. On one hand, it's reliant on the regional grids for power, but it's also a leader in this transformation and has been for security issues. And the DoD is the largest federal consumer of energy. So if you can talk a little bit about that.
I will. So we're not only the largest federal consumer of energy, we're the largest producer of emissions. We get both those titles. So there's some interesting work going on. We need to understand our electrical grid. We're all dependent on it. And in many ways, it means we're interconnected. So for the Navy, some things they've tried. San Diego was about to have a heat wave. They knew they didn't have enough power to provide the ships that were based there and manage the population. So the Navy offered to take the ships off the grid during this period of the heat wave, and the ships ran on their own power, alleviating the demand on San Diego and preventing them from having to go into brownouts. So we can be good neighbors and help each other. But then in another agreement that just happened this year, the Navy agrees to, as much as possible, plug the ships into the San Diego power system. So when the ships aren't running, they're producing their own power, they're not consuming fossil fuel. So most of our electricity on the ship comes from a diesel engine, some of the older ships, a steam plant that's run by a boiler, so they're all fossil fuel. If they plug into the San Diego grid and they're not running the fossil fuel, San Diego gets the credit, the carbon emission credit for us not running our fossil fuel. So there's things we can do to be good neighbors and help each other. I think in the end, as we start to build these microgrids and alternate energy, and we've put windbirds down in Cuba, the Navy has solar panels going up everywhere. We could probably stop, not just reduce our consumption of energy, but we could probably start becoming a generator of energy and help our neighbors when there's a crisis.
Right. And Tom, just to bring you back in here, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation releases these annual assessments. I know you're very familiar with them as a former advisor for them, but it looks more and more dire every year. More of the country is enveloped in elevated blackout risks. And they have acknowledged that the traditional way of determining reliability, which is look at your peak demand and buy a percentage of extra capacity or secure an extra percentage of capacity above that, whether it's 10, 15%. This is not reliable or adequate enough, I should say. What should be done like in this new era where you have renewables and there is a need to pay generators and suppliers for other attributes like being able to ramp up and down? What's the solution here?
Thank you, Naureen. Well, absolutely, we need to start looking at new and innovative ways to measure our reserve margins. We know when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, we're not going to get any wind, we're not going to get any solar. So we certainly need to look at that. I believe what Brett Perlman said, we all need to come to the table. And I also believe what Paul Segal said as well in terms of duration, solving the problems from a durational standpoint as well. And so we definitely need to take a look at those reserve margins. We need to kind of include everything. When we look at going forward, we need to understand that we'll transition to wind and solar, but we still need to rely on our fossil-fired resources. And yes, those generating resources need to be paid for the reliability and the resilience that they provide. So there are reliability must-run provisions where states are able to have generators stay online to prevent these types of situations, but really not enough is being done. When we look at the storage situation, for example, we have basically a limit of 4-hour duration battery storage. We're just not there yet. So until our technologies improve and our ability to meet peak demand improves, it really has to be that all of the above. We need to continue to support resources that are providing peaking capacity and helping to meet those demands that we have. And we need to continue to invest in the emerging technologies, and kind of using Texas again as that example and building off of some of Brett's comments as well. A number of studies absolutely showed that Texas would have benefited by incremental transmission coming into the state. They could have been able to bring in actually wind and solar from the west because of the time zone differential and the differential in peak hours between those locations, and help alleviate that problem. Consequentially, Texas also, had they had more transmission to leave the state, could have alleviated some of the situations in the eastern part of the country during Winter Storm Elliott. So to answer the question, we definitely need to look at, we're going to be growing this grid. We're going to be electrifying. Demand is going to be going up much greater than this 0.5 to 1% that we've seen. It's going to perhaps even approach double digits. We've seen in Texas, for example, as Brett mentioned, with the 85,000 megawatts of peak demand, that was shattered the old records out of the ballpark. And we're continuing to see double-digit growth for these peak demands. So it's an all of the above approach. We need our existing resources. We need to invest in our new resources of the future. We need to do that in order to reduce the carbon footprint. And we also need to invest in emerging technologies. And as Admiral Howard has alluded to, it actually is a national security concern.
And speaking of making sure that existing resources perform, we have another question from a viewer, Tom. You were part of the federal inquiry into Winter Storm Uri, which revealed grave risks to the electric power supply and public safety because renewable output was reduced by storms and gas generators couldn't get fuel. Winter Storm Elliott last Christmas demonstrated the same vulnerability. What legislation or regulation could reduce this threat significantly?
Well, again, in a couple areas. Number one, I think we do need the permitting reform around transmission. And of course, Paul alluded to a lot of the questions around that. It needs to be in an economically competitive arena where we're looking at the true economics. So we can't be picking winners and losers. We have to be picking those that are the best equipped to meet our reliability needs. At the same time, there is an opportunity for changes in market structures so that we do compensate those generators that are providing the flexibility to provide resilience and reliability that we need. So I think both of those areas, there's things on the transmission side that we can be looking at, and also on the generation side as well.
And this question, I think I'll start with Brett. Would you say, it's another question from a viewer, would you say that consumers making their own choices through carbon fee and redistribution qualifies as predictable, coherent policy?
Not sure I understand the question. So are they saying that customers that want to reduce their own carbon footprint, is that what the question is?
Yeah, like if it's a consumer driven policy, is that enough? Like, or do you need, like, I take it as like a big, like an orchestra or a conductor, like kind of driving change from like a higher up?
Oh yeah, well, I think we need both. I mean, I think we do need, I think Paul talked about it. We need a national policy, whether it's a carbon tax or cap and trade, or, you know, we're sort of using lots of carrots and no sticks right now. We need more of a balanced policy that sort of includes everybody from the top down. But I think, you know, individual consumers can make choices as well, and we ought to empower them to do that. And so if consumers want to purchase carbon credits, our RECs, you know, RECs in Texas are cheap now. They're almost free because we have so much renewable energy. You know, consumers ought to be able to do that. And so I don't think one to the exclusion of another is enough. I think we need, all these policies working in concert in order to achieve the goal, sort of under a national umbrella.
And we're almost out of time, so I'll maybe ask one final question, and I'll start with you, Paul. If you could wave a magic wand and make one change to the current grid, it could be a policy change, it could be like a technical change, or technology change, what would it be and why?
Yeah, I think it ties back to transmission, and I think what we really need is FERC to act like a strong regulator. And there might be a question of whether or not they need incremental legislation to support this, but we need a central entity ideally planning high voltage transmission to create interconnection between these regions in a way that where there is clarity around who pays for it and that it will get paid. I think without without that type of regulator functioning in the market, it may be very difficult and very piecemeal to do much beyond incrementally rebuilding the grid that we already have.
Admiral, what would your wish be?
I would want a national transmission plan that looked at our energy and takes us from where we are to a grid so we're self-sufficient, it's resilient, and all consumers are supported, whether they're the individual citizen or the US government or our military.
And Brett?
Well, I wrote it down. I think Paul said it. We want a durable national policy driven by economics. If we just have that, we can disagree about the details, but if we just have that sort of framework, I think we'd get a long way in solving some of these problems.
And Tom, tell us your wish and what's going to be coming ahead after the Grid and Peril report.
Very good. Well, to echo my peers here, certainly it is a national long-term approach. We have been slapping Band-Aids on this grid for so long, and it really is such a piecemeal system that we have now. So we need this national long-term approach with everybody having a seat at the table. That's something that I hope to pull together here in our initiatives at SAFE as well. When we talked about the Eisenhower Interstate project, we actually looked well into the future, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, how many cars, what would the weight be, what would the degradation be? And so we plan that system that way. We need to plan our national grid the same way. And in terms of what is coming down the pike, we developed our report, Grid and Peril, which is released today. That's a problem statement report, a little bit easier perhaps to actually identify the problems. The next in the series will be around those solution sets. And so our subsequent reports will center next around transmission and then generation, and then we'll shift to cyber and physical security, and then really that overarching aspect of national security and how they're all a part of our national security. So that's what we'll see going forward from SAFE.
Great. Well, thank you all for your help. This was an incredible start to an important conversation that we're going to be having for months or years to come.